One of the things that you were supposed to read today, in addition to the overview in the Berger textbook, was an introduction to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Epic of Gilgamesh, well, let's back up. An epic is a really long story with a main character who faces some obstacles and eventually overcomes them. And the real important thing about epics is that there are lessons that you can learn from them, right? And epics appear in all sorts of different civilizations. You might be familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey of the Greek civilizations. Next week, we're going to look at the Rig Veda and the Mahabharata and ancient Vedic civilizations in India. We're going to look at Chinese epics. We're going to look at Roman epics. And while a lot of these aren't historically accurate, and they can't be because they talk about gods and they talk about all sorts of things that there's just no way could have happened in the ancient world, that doesn't mean that we can't look at them as historical documents. Instead, what we can do is use them as a way to figure out what people thought was important and what they valued. And I think a really good parallel to consider is the story of George Washington and the apple tree. And if you don't know it, let me give you a quick Cliff's Notes version, right? So George Washington is a little boy, and he's out messing around, and his father has an apple tree, and George has an axe, and he decides he's going to chop it down. Why? Because he's a little kid, and little kids like doing stuff like that. And his father finds it, and he goes up to George, and he says, "Son, did you chop down my apple tree?" And actually, I think it's a cherry tree in the story. So whatever, it doesn't matter. "Did you chop down my tree?" And George Washington apparently looks up at his father and says, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down your tree. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." Stupid story, right? One, it probably never happened. And two, what type of kid caught like that without any actual evidence would actually fess up to it? But why people tell that story and why it's told to school children is to say, look, George Washington, one of the founders of our country, one of our great American heroes and patriots, he did something stupid as a kid, but he told the truth, and despite that, he was still able to become an American patriot, right? So the takeaway lesson is you can do bad things, but as long as you own up to them and tell the truth, you can become a great person. So what I would love for you to do, you've got two excerpts from the Epic of Gilgamesh. One's a really short one. It has to do with a dream that Gilgamesh's best friend Enkidu has about the afterlife, about what happens to you, where you go when you die. As you read that, I want you to consider, okay, how does he describe the afterlife? Would you think it's like heaven? Would you think it's like hell? And why would ancient Sumerians think that's what happens when you die? In other words, is it an awesome place? Is it a crappy place? Does something happen? Who do they interact with? And why would they think about it that way? The second excerpt I have you reading comes from a portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh that deals with the gods getting really angry and sending a flood to destroy all of mankind. And the story of the flood predates the biblical story of the flood by quite a good span of time. This story comes from a dude that Gilgamesh is talking to. He has a really weird name. I normally call him U because his name is Uptimasham. I always screw it up. It's long. But as you go through that story of the flood, think about, again, how individuals might see themselves in relationship to their gods, but also what that description can tell us about the society in which you lived. What are the things people do? What are the characteristics of civilization we see there? And how can this story that is largely bound to be fictional helpful in giving us insight into people of ancient Sumeria?